I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, an internationally recognized thought leader known as the disaster avoidance expert. Dr. Galib is on a mission. Dr. Galeb is on a mission to protect leaders from a dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases. He does so by using a combination of his pragmatic business experience and cutting edge neuroscience and behavioral economics research to develop the most effective strategies for making decisions, managing risk, developing strategic plans, and avoiding business disasters. A best-selling author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is best known for his Never Go With Your Gut, how pioneering leaders make the best decisions and avoid business disasters, published by Career Press. His newest book, published by Changemakers Books, is Resilience, Adapt and Plan for a New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews at prominent venues. These include Time Magazine, CBS News, Business Insider, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, CNBC, and Fast Company. Dr. Gleb's experience comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, speaking, and training experience as a CEO of disaster avoidance experts. His clients include innovative startups, large nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies such as Aflac, Honda, Wells Fargo, the World Wildlife Fund, and Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist. He's spent over 15 years in higher education, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University, where he published dozens of peer-reviewed articles. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid disasters in his own personal life. To help you take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, we've asked him to share with us about COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic adaptation and planning via neuroscience for project managers. Let me please welcome Dr. Gleb. Aloha.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Great, so let's talk a little bit about how project managers can effectively adapt and plan for COVID-19. That's the goal of today's meeting. And it's not an easy topic. It's going to be hopefully not too depressing, but sobering, because this is a painful issue and it will go on for much longer than most folks think. That's something I want to prepare you for from the beginning. Lots of people underprepared, underestimated the seriousness of the pandemic. Very prominent people. So let's talk about Elon Musk. Very, very prominent entrepreneur, runs Tesla, SpaceX, founded those. Well, on March 6th, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb, just as COVID-19 was taking root here in the US. And just a few days later, after the declaration of the national emergency here in the US on March 19th, he tweeted that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, we have over 6 million cases and over 85,000 people dead, and it's not close to being over at all. Tragically, he is deeply mistaken. And so are many other people who listen to him. He's a big, big influencer. I mean, look at the first one, the retweets, the likes. He is followed by very many people, including project managers, of course. And so lots of folks, especially this is kind of new money, entrepreneurial people made mistakes by following his advice. But he wasn't the only one. So we're talking about entrepreneurs, startup founders, big unicorn, whatever, Tesla, SpaceX. But old money made big mistakes as well. Let's talk about Goldman Sachs. Doesn't get more old money than that. They provide guidance to their investors on how to invest. And one of the biggest things they look at is US GDP growth. And so they made an estimate that in the second quarter of this year, US GDP growth on February 24th, they made an estimate that it will be 2.7%. So 2.7% growth, they estimate in February 24th. Now, just a few days later, in fact, about 2 weeks, so 3 weeks later, March 15th, they changed their estimate. And what was their new estimate? 3 weeks later, what was their new estimate? 5% decline, 7.7% shift in GDP from in 3 weeks. That's a pretty terrible, pretty terrible estimate. Clearly they were off. Now let's see what happened only 5 days later on March 20th. They made another estimate. They revised their previous estimate and said that instead of a 5% decline, it will be a 24% decline. 24%, very much off. Obviously, they screwed up. Now, when final numbers came out, we know that in reality, it was a 32.9% decline for the second quarter. So clearly, they were off even their worst estimates. Unfortunate, and very many people listened to them. So old money that really followed. A lot of folks listened to them, including, of course, some project managers and business leaders who then influence project managers. So these are bad news and bad mistakes companies make. And most companies were unprepared, really unprepared to deal with the current situation. So what I want you to do right now is go to the website that you see there, or that you see in the notes, and go to the poll. So there's going to be a poll, which you can take. I will copy that in the chat. So check out the chat and you will be able to see the link to the poll. So again, look at the poll. Yes, check out the speaker view. Please go to the poll. It's going to be in the chat. And we'll be taking polls to see how your company responded, what's going on in your company, what are the reactions. Give you about 15 seconds to get there. You can just go to the chat and click on the link in the chat or type in the link that you see in my slides. And you should see right now, when you get there, that meeting status is waiting. And now you should be able to see that meeting status is open enabled. What I want to ask you is, way back in March, your organization, how well did it do in anticipating the damaging impact of the pandemic? Please vote right now. Please vote. We have 64 participants. Let's get high numbers. I see that only 47% found, only 47 folks found the website. We have 64 people. Let's get the rest on the website. "48 people out of 64 on the website. Let's get the rest." I'll give you about 10 more seconds to get on the website and vote. All right, so let's see what happened in your companies. About just under 5% moderately overestimated its impact, but the rest, 95% of you, got it spot on. So about 20% of you got it spot on. So about 25% either got it spot on, and then the 75% of you underestimated its impact. And of those who underestimated its impact, 50% moderately underestimated its impact. And 25% of the companies, organizations in which you work seriously underestimated the impact. And that is indeed indicative. So as Elon Musk, as Goldman Sachs, a lot of people listened to them and they made a lot of bad mistakes. People who listened to them made a lot of bad mistakes. They either moderately or seriously underestimated the impact. So you see that only 25%, the only 25% of you that got it spot on, very small amount of you moderately overestimated the impact. Great. And we'll be voting this way throughout the poll. So please make sure to keep that open. Make sure to keep that website open. Many leaders and companies underestimated the threat. And we see that that was the case for the companies, organizations where many of you worked. They were caught unprepared. And this resulted in them turning to the only thing they had, their emergency business continuity plans. And speaking as someone who made a lot of business continuity plans, I'm a disaster avoidance expert. That's one of my standard consulting engagements. I can tell you that they're not a bad fit. They're not a good fit for the situation. That's not what they're for. They're not a good fit for the pandemic situation because they're great for emergencies. That's what they're for. Major flood, major typhoon, hurricane, that's what they're good for. A 1 to 2, 3-week interruption in your business. But that's not what COVID-19 is. It's not an emergency. It's a major, huge disruptor. It's a large, long-term, high-impact, slow-moving threat. That's what it is. It's a major disruptor. Just like the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis. That's a major, huge disruptor. It's not a slow-moving, it's not an immediate, quick emergency. But the vast majority of business continuity plans, that's what they're for. They're for sprints. But COVID-19 is a marathon. So relying on business continuity plans led a lot of companies into many, many problems. That's something to address. That's something to think about and realize. But the only way out of COVID-19, the only realistic way, based on all the evaluations, estimates, we can talk in the Q&A about herd immunity and medical treatments. Basically, very shortly, they're not going to work. But we can talk in the Q&A about, if you want to, more details about why they won't work. I won't take up our time here. Vaccine is the only effective solution. It's the only effective solution. And human trials to go for a vaccine are going to take at least a year to test their safety and effectiveness. And that's going to be if we throw all the money at it, which we are, and take out all the bureaucratic red tape, which we are, as opposed to the usual 4 to 5 years. And if we don't cut any huge corners like Russia and China are doing, that would probably make a vaccine that's not very safe or effective. We don't want that because we're already having a lot of problems in getting people to take the vaccine, and I'll talk about that. Now you want to realize that because of these quality trials, most vaccines don't make it through human trials. They just don't. They're not effective, and especially COVID-19. The vaccines are rushed into production. So the COVID-19 vaccines were rushed into production based on our initial evaluation of the COVID-19 strain. But much more recently, a new strain, that was the original strain, and all the vaccines that we currently have in production are targeted at the original strain that started in Wuhan, China. But about 2 months ago, a research paper was published, which peer-reviewed, very prestigious publication, which demonstrated that a much more infectious strain of COVID-19 has since mutated in the nose, and it's become the most prominent strain around the world, including in the US, including in Hawaii. And that is something that's much more problematic. It's much more infectious. It's not more deadly, but it spreads much easier. So that's why it's become much more prevalent. And the vaccines, we don't know whether the original vaccines that were good for the original strain are going to be good for the new strain. This is one of the reasons why the vaccines might fail, and there are many other reasons. It's unlikely, very unlikely, the first vaccines will be successful. And then after a vaccine is ready, what happens? Well, the government needs to coordinate the process of producing it, distributing it, and vaccinating people. We know from studies that only about 50 to 60% of the population are ready and willing to take a vaccine. You know, many people are skeptical of vaccines, and anti-vaxxer sentiment is widespread, especially given the way that there seems to be some serious politicization around the vaccine question that makes many people much more skeptical. And we've seen the government not be very confident, not be very competent at all at creating testing, good testing for and good contact tracing, providing personal protective equipment, ventilators. So there's no reason to assume that it will be supremely great at the vaccine production. Now, so how long will it take to produce, distribute, and vaccinate people? Even at a moderate level of government competence, substantially higher than it showed in producing, let's say, testing and contact tracing. And this, of course, has to be the federal government because it's a centralized effort to produce and distribute vaccines. I can't imagine the horror that it would be if it's a state-based effort. Let's not even go there. So this would be at least a year at the moderate level of government competence. With an excellent level of government competence, it might take as short as 6 months. And that's a supremely, supremely high level of government competence, much, much more competent than the government has shown in recent history. And maybe something more like government level of competence in World War II, so kind of a militarization effort of some sort. So let's talk about possible timelines for a vaccine. There's optimistic, there's moderate, and there's pessimistic. For an optimistic timeline, let's assume that we get supremely lucky and the early vaccines, one of them is successful. The Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, one of those is successful. The AstraZeneca, it's going to be approved for mass production by summer of 2021. And then production, distribution, vaccination with a supremely high level of government competence would take only 6 months. So then COVID-19 will be over with most people vaccinated by early 2022. This is the most possible optimistic timeline. We have no realistic way of getting there with most people vaccinated before early 2022, before that timeline. And this is a pretty low probability. I'd say no higher than 25%, likely lower, but let's just say that it's 25%. Moderate timeline, this is much more likely. This is likely the world in which we live. We're not likely living in the optimistic world. We're likely living in the moderate world. So moderate timeline. It's approved for mass production by 2023. That's because the first variation of the vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, they have not succeeded because of these reasons that I outlined. They're pretty unlikely to be successful. It's just low probability. So it's going to be approved for mass production, not by 2022, summer 2021, but somewhere in 22, 23, 24, something like that. And then production, distribution, vaccination at a moderate level of government competence takes a year. So then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. This is most likely what's going to be the case. This is what you should plan for as a moderate, realistic scenario. So if you want to make sure to not plan for the most optimistic scenario, this is not something, hope is not a strategy. Don't plan for it. This is 50% likelihood. So 50% likelihood I'm putting on a span of timing with most people vaccinated from late 2022 to late 2026 with a midpoint of 2024. Now, unfortunately, we might also be living in a bad world, in a pessimistic world. The universe can be showing us the middle finger. So perhaps it's going to be much harder to find a vaccine, an effective vaccine that's, when I talk about effective vaccine, I'm talking about 80–90% effectiveness. 80–90% effectiveness vaccine, we might not find it until 2026. So it's going to be a sad world, it's going to be a harsh world, but that's something that might well happen. And production, distribution, vaccination will take a year to moderate level of government competence. So most people will be vaccinated by 2027. This is a pessimistic scenario, but it's quite realistic. You know what? I'm going to give it 25% because we still haven't found an effective vaccine for the flu. You might think I'm too cynical, but that's the reality. We've been trying to find an effective vaccine for the flu for over a century, and we haven't found one. It's the ones we have are only 50% effective, which wouldn't make too much of a difference with COVID-19. It's much better than nothing, but we'd still be suffering from the pandemic. So this is where we are. This is the world in which we live. And so I want to ask you, if you go to the poll, based on what we've just talked about, which of the vaccine scenarios will you plan for going forward? So please vote on the poll. Which of the vaccine scenarios will you plan for going forward? Please vote. And if you haven't had a chance to go to the website, you will be able to see it in the chat. So just go to the chat and you can go to the polling website. I encourage you to make sure to go there. So we see that 80% of the people voted, and we don't have everyone. We have 65 participants, but only 49 people on the website. So I encourage the rest of the people to go to the website, have your voice heard, make sure that you're represented. All right, we have 88% of the people who are on the website who voted. So let's give people about 5 more seconds to vote. All right, so we see that out of a total of about just over 25%, over a quarter of you are going to be hoping for the optimistic scenario. Okay, I disagree with that, and I'll talk about why. You should not do that. That's not a good idea, but we'll talk about that. The large majority of you, just under 2/3, are going to be planning for the moderate scenario. Good, and that's something you could certainly plan for. Also, I would encourage you, if you have the resources, to plan for the pessimistic scenario, which just under 10% of you are going to be planning for, because you want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. I mean, I'm sure you, as project managers, you know that that's what you need to do for a project. You know that. Hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And that is the right strategy to address COVID-19. So that's what you want to be doing. All right, let's go on to talking about decision-making, how we make our decisions. And first of all, I just want to tell you that this is not easy information to hear. This is painful and it's really stressful. Now, as an expert in disaster avoidance, risk management, strategic planning, I started looking at COVID-19 pretty early, when it was in early January when I saw that it was becoming a serious issue in Wuhan, China. Most people didn't because they were, well, Wuhan, it's middle of nowhere, China. But looking at Wuhan, China, it's actually a major metropolis, has over 11 million people, over $22 billion in economic production. It has something like 200 international flights per day. So imagine those double-decker Chinese planes carrying 500 people. That's about 10,000 people in and out. Of course, COVID-19 was not going to stay isolated in Wuhan. Of course, it was going to spread widely. No wonder that the first place outside of Asia where it spread was northern Italy, which has strong ties to Wuhan because of clothing manufacturing there. So it's very clearly going to be spread. And I saw that and I knew that and I started researching it. And I saw that this was going to be really bad, much worse than people thought. I mean, if it did that, such a painful trouble for a major metropolis that was quite well developed like Wuhan, I mean, the rest, it would certainly be seriously damaging for highly developed countries like Italy and US and so on, which it did prove to be. And so looking at that, I started publishing articles, doing already, you can see my articles in Business Insider, Columbus, the Columbus Dispatch, Inc. magazine in early March when I was talking about that this was going to be much worse than people thought. And most people didn't pay attention to that. I mean, I struggled with this. It was very painful for me to realize this and to internalize it and to start talking about this to my clients. And my clients, the ones who were steady clients who I was kept on consulting and coaching, they were finding it really difficult to accept as well. What really helps to accept this is this will be much more painful in the long term if we don't accept and adapt to this major disruption. If you plan for the optimistic scenario, that 26.67% of you who are planning for the optimistic scenario, you're essentially not accepting the truth of the reality. You are looking at this and you're not preparing for the pain for the long term. That's a very optimistic perspective, and that's not really a great perspective for a project manager who knows how many things can go wrong with projects and who knows that the optimistic scenario, the 25% chance scenario is unlikely to occur. Not everything will go perfectly right. Imagine, when was the last time with a project that you managed when everything went perfectly according to plan? Not that often, right? Problems arise, issues arise. So that optimistic scenario will be very unlikely to occur. 75% chance there'll be a moderate or pessimistic scenario. So what are we facing? Our future until widespread vaccination. What are we actually dealing with? Well, we'll have looser restrictions, and we saw that in a number of states that opened up too early. Texas, Arizona, Florida, Hawaii did quite a bit better, but still had some issues. Then an increase. I think Hawaii had more issues in closing down in a timely manner. Too many tourists were still accepted too early, too much in Hawaii until it had pretty good restrictions later onward. So we see loosened restrictions and an increase in cases. And of course, before the situation gets nearly as bad as in New York City or as bad as it got in Texas, Florida, Arizona, California, a number of states will have learned from this. And there will be tighter restrictions and a decrease in cases. And that's what we're seeing around the US and around the world, by the way. We're seeing these repeating waves of looser restrictions, increasing cases, tighter restrictions, decreasing cases. So we'll be dealing with various levels of shutdowns and social distancing until the vaccine becomes widely available. The world will change forever. It will change in very deep ways because these waves of restrictions and living in fear, this stress and strain, they'll change our habits, they'll change our values, desires. We'll never go back to that halcyon world, anti-pandemic. We'll never go back to January 2020. However much pain this causes you. It causes me a lot of pain to realize that as well. You know, I lost a lot of business. I do public speaking, training, consulting, and coaching. That's the vast majority of my business is in person. I lost all of that. So I'm feeling a lot of economic pain, and I'm feeling a lot of stress with my family, my loved ones. I mean, my parents, my dad got most likely COVID-19 when he was in New York City, just not enough testing to test for it. He was very sick for a very long time, and it was very stressful and very painful for me to deal with it. So I can totally understand the pain and stress that other people are suffering, which is, of course, in many ways different from mine, but in some ways the same. Your role as a trusted advisor, so you're a project manager. Your key role is as a trusted advisor to your leadership. Your leaders need to be empowered to realize how much of a disruption we're in. Most are way too optimistic, still way too optimistic. You need to help them prepare for this uncomfortable reality. You need to help them accept the truth of the matter. And by doing so, you'll help them achieve their leadership goals. Whatever their leadership goals are, not by denying the truth of reality, it's not going to help them. It's going to hurt them. And you will be helping them achieve their leadership goals by helping them realize these facts. And you will also build trust in you as a trusted advisor by helping them realize these facts that they need to face, they need to deal with, despite the pain of them. I want to encourage you again, the 26.67% of you who plan for the optimistic scenario, to not plan for the optimistic scenario. There are too many companies, too many organizations. They expect that the problems will blow over, so they think that everything will go back to normal. But hope is not a strategy. Hoping is not a strategy, and as project managers, you know that. That's what you get your degrees in. Hope is not a strategy. This is a quote attributed to Vince Lombardi, great football coach. I want to encourage you to prepare for the moderate, or ideally, if you have the resources, the pessimistic scenario. Now, why do we want to prepare for the hopeful scenario, the optimistic one, despite everything that I was saying? Well, we make very bad decisions about such threats that are unusual, slow-moving, high-impact, because of how our brain is wired, because of the way we think. Our gut reaction, our intuition, our instinct is to underestimate such threats. And this leads to decisions that endanger our businesses and our organizations if we're working in non-businesses. The bad advice about trusting your gut is common because of dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. Cognitive neuroscientists and behavioral economists like myself refer to these dangerous judgment errors as cognitive biases. They come from our evolutionary background and how our brains are wired. What we are increasingly finding is that we're not evolved for the modern environment, which really shouldn't be a surprise. The modern environment has really been around since World War II. But our gut intuitions, our instincts, it takes a very long time to evolve. Dozens and dozens of thousands of years. That's how long it takes to evolve. And we're still adapted for the savanna environment. That's what our gut intuitions, our reactions are for, our natural intuitive decision-making processes. There wouldn't be a need for project managers if humans naturally made perfect decisions. We'd just be going forward and managing our projects the way we should. There wouldn't be any need for training for this. You wouldn't be needing to get credit for this if we made naturally right and appropriate decisions. We don't. Our brain is not wired for that. And the primary issue that we face when dealing with threats like COVID-19 is the fight or flight response. In a savanna environment, the fight or flight response was great. It was life-saving for hunter-gatherers because of the kind of threats they faced. The risks they faced were intense, immediate, in the moment. Saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as a saber-toothed tiger response, when you have to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. That's what our ancestors had to do, and we still have that in us because we're the descendants of those who were successful in fleeing the saber-toothed tigers and who were successful in the fight response and fighting off opposing tribal members. We still have those instincts, and we're the descendants of those who have those responses. But it's not a good response in today's world. That's not the kind of risks we face in today's world. We face more long-term risks, uncertain risks. We face risks such as getting a notification on our smartphone about an article someone forwarded you about a weird disease in the middle of nowhere, China, Wuhan, China, right? Well, as we talked about, it's not in the middle of nowhere. So that is not a good response. We don't react well to these sorts of threats. Specifically, I want to highlight 3 dangerous judgment errors, 3 cognitive biases that cause us to have bad responses in the context of COVID-19. The normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. Normalcy bias. So In the Savannah environment, it was very natural and intuitive for us to see the future as informed by the past. And everything will go normally. That's what we had to assume, and that was true. The only change would be change of the season. Spring, summer, fall, winter, that was the only change that we really had to deal with. We did not deal with major changes in the Savannah environment. So we safely assumed that the short-term future, the next several years, would be based on the short-term past. But that is not true in today's world. Well, think about the kind of major disruptors we live in. What about smartphones? How much have they changed our lives? We've really shifted our lives because of them. Social media has really shifted the way that we get information, that are influenced by others, connected to others. The 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, sweeping around the globe, really changed us. And of course, COVID-19. That's not something we anticipate. And so we underestimate both the likelihood, possibility, and the impact of these major disruptors of various sorts. Technology, biology, human fiscal disruptors, and so on. Planning fallacy. Planning fallacy, we tend to assume that the future will go according to plan. And as a project managers, you should know that that's not how plans often work. When you make a project plan, often things don't go according to plan. But too many people underestimate the problems and risks that are likely to take place. So that's really problematic and a problematic mental habit. We underestimate the resources we need of time, money, information, social capital, all sorts of resources. When we manage our plans or when we look at our projects, we make bad decisions all the time and overestimate we are over optimistic about the likelihood that everything will go according to plan. Finally, hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting is perceiving the short-term future as more important than the long-term future. Now, this was a safe bet in the Savannah environment because if you killed the mammoth, you need to eat as much of the meat as possible before it's rotted. In the modern environment, you can put it in the fridge and store it for tomorrow. Well, hopefully you're not killing mammoths in the modern environment, but you're getting money, you're investing it in the bank. You can save for the future. Your organization can have multi-quarter, long-term, year-long, many years-long projects that are going to be effective over the long term. But it's very easy to underestimate the long-term future. And as project managers, I'm sure you've seen that happen very often, underestimation of the long-term future. So we prioritize the short-term and hurt the long-term. Bad in project management, bad in reacting to high-impact, low-probability, slow-moving threats like COVID-19, underestimating the long-term outcomes and impacts. So here are the three cognitive biases that are most problematic for COVID-19. And right now, I want you to go to the poll that we did before and take a look at the poll. And go on to the next one. Which of these cognitive biases is most problematic for your organization, do you think? The normalcy bias, planning fallacy, or hyperbolic discounting? So let's vote. Again, we have 65 participants. I see 50 people on the polling website, so I hope a few more people join us. Make sure to have your voice heard and represented as we vote and we engage. All right, so 51 people, thank you whoever joined us, appreciate it. So you see of the people on the website, 84% of the people voted. Let's get a couple more people voting, and some people I'm sure have difficulty deciding which is the most problematic. I'll give you 5 more seconds, so please decide. Thank you for deciding, number 54, number 44. All right, we're good. Closing the poll. Okay, so you should be able to see on my screen that normalcy bias is the biggest problem that you identified. So just under 40% see this as the most serious problem in their organization. The next most serious, approximately tied, just a little bit more, just under a third, see planning fallacy as the biggest problem. So that's under a third, and just over a quarter see hyperbolic discounting as the biggest problem. So good, so that's something that you need to realize. Whatever you see as the biggest problem, that's something you really want to address first of all. Get this information to the people in your organization, to the leaders, and address it in the short term. The other problems, address them in the moderate term, or of course you can bring information about all of these at the same time. All right, so Let's talk a little bit about how to address these problems. How can businesses prepare? How can organizations prepare? So how can businesses prepare, organizations of all sorts? How can you prepare for COVID-19? You want to make fundamental, basic changes to your business model. We'll have so many more virtual interactions in the future. This meeting, this presentation is something that we will have much more of in the future, and there will be much more variety than Zoom, and Zoom will be built up with its various integrations. So you're seeing me present in an innovative manner, this innovative style that I'm using a software called Prezi Video, which integrates with Zoom and has a much more engaging visual feature than PowerPoint, for example. So this is something that you'll see much more of, and we'll be interacting in virtual ways. And I want to encourage you to make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings. A lot of people think they'll go back to the office. They want to open things up and get back to normal. Well, they're falling into the normalcy bias, which we just talked about is the biggest problem by far for about 40% for your organization. That is the biggest problem. People rushing back to reopen. They want to go back to what was normal. They want to go back to January 2020, but we'll never go back there. People's habits, norms, and values will change. So I want to encourage you right now to make that commitment, and you will save yourself some serious money by ending office space, please. So that's something that you want to be thinking about and advising your leaders. So let's talk about the changes to the internal business model that you want to make as part of this transition. Your internal controls, of course, that's going to be an important question. Ensuring financial security, that's going to be you're going to be ensuring it in a different way if you're going to be all virtual or mostly virtual. A number of my clients downsized their office to about 90% of what it was. I'm sorry, downsized they reduced it by 90%, so they left 10% of what it was. And there are only 1 or 2 people who are coming into the office to deal with paperwork, checks, and so on. And so that's what they're dealing with. And they're ensuring financial security in a number of digital ways. There are a number of ways of ensuring financial security. As part of that, you want to prevent cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And that's going to be a much more of an issue right now. The FBI has reported a lot more hacking going on because people who are working at home, they're not used to following the typical cybersecurity protocols. So they're not following these guidelines that they should be. And their hardware and software is not hardened at home. I mean, one of my clients had an executive who was an older gentleman who, when he couldn't access his virtual desktop from his home, turned off his Windows firewall, which is a terrible idea. So that is not a good idea, but that's what happens when people are not quite well educated about what to do on their computers. So home office setup is not very good. You want to adapt existing compliance practices. Whatever compliance practices, they're going to be different in a virtual setting, whether cyberbullying, real bullying, harassment, all of that sort of stuff. You want to adapt them to the virtual environment and pursue compliance with CDC guidelines to the extent that you're doing in-office activities. So a number of my clients went 100% virtual. They're doing some, when they need to meet, they're meeting outside in a co-working space of some sort, for example. Sometimes inside if they have appropriate social distancing and if it's not a long meeting. And revise internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency. With a lot of flex time, people working at home, disruptions, effectiveness and efficiency should be measured differently. Less time worked than per project accomplished. So activities accomplished. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Motivation engagement. How is that relevant? Well, before the pandemic, only 34% of all employees were fully engaged, which means they're creative, they're problem solving, willing to sacrifice for the team. They were fully engaged. Working from home means that even less people will be engaged. They lack motivation for being near other employees. We get a lot from work. We get a sense of meaning, purpose, fulfillment. That's really important for us. And we miss that when we are working at home. We don't have that unless we're given appropriate professional development of how to replace it and how to find these connections in virtual settings and in other venues. There's also the stress of adjusting your personal life and household to the pandemic, of course. Children at home, not going to schools, taking care of elders, not being able to have a social life that you used to have. This is all really stressful, and this needs to be addressed. So provide support and guidance to employees, provide professional development. Effective communication. This is another area of professional development that most folks don't think about sufficiently. Virtual communication is really difficult for those who are used to face-to-face communication. because most virtual communication takes place in text. Virtual collaboration platforms like Trello, Microsoft Teams, Asana, Mondays, and so on, Slack. I really hope you're using a virtual collaboration software. Just all emails is much worse than that. But collaboration software is certainly better, but all of this communication takes place by text, and it's very easy to have misunderstandings. When I say something like, I think Kane should take that project, or I think Kane should take that project, those two sentences mean very different things. But without my tone of voice, when I write them down, they mean the same thing. And you're also losing body gestures, expressions of anxiety, worry, concern, surprise. You're losing all of these sorts of things, which are the important subtle undertones that underpin our communication. It's essential to provide employees with training, professional development on communicating effectively in virtual teams. Then you want to also provide them with professional training in teamwork, collaboration, especially resolving conflicts. In face-to-face interactions, it's natural to notice and resolve problems. Having the little chat over a water cooler or in the hallway, when you notice somebody having weird expressions or body gestures, tone, you're having someone who's crossing their arms and being all defensive, you can have a conversation with that person. You're not going to notice that in a virtual setting. It's much easier for problems to go unnoticed, and because of communication difficulties, it's harder to solve them. So this is another area of professional development. Resolving conflict. So then next from that is cultivating trust. We naturally cultivate trust in in-person environments. In office settings, it's easy to build those relationships, get trust, get to know each other. In virtual settings, it's much harder to do. It doesn't happen naturally as it does in office environments. And this is not a matter of training, by the way. This is a matter of creating appropriate venues. We can talk about that in the Q&A. And accountability. This is a really important aspect of things that people don't think about nearly enough. In an office environment, as a supervisor, you can easily hold people accountable. You can walk around, chat with people, check in with them, what's going on. And also, as a peer, you can hold other people accountable. As a project manager, if you need something from somebody else, you can pop into their office and say, hey, Michael, where's that project to report that you promised me? Well, it's much harder for Michael to ignore you standing in his office door than it is for Michael to ignore a Slack message. So new structures, you need to create new structures to enable accountability, both up the chain of command and peer-to-peer accountability. So these are the 6 areas of the internal business model that you need to change in order to be effective for the situation, for COVID-19. And you want to be thinking about your external business model. There are 6 areas that you want to change here as well. Service delivery, relationships, managing disruptions, shifting norms, unknown unknowns, and outcompeting your competition. Service delivery. You want to transition your offerings, whatever you're doing, to virtual or socially distanced delivery. Just like I mentioned, I lost the large majority of my income because my company, Disaster Avoidance Experts, does vastly in person. Almost all of our work was in person, speaking, training, consulting, and coaching. Now we're switching all to virtual, and you can do a number of these same things, or at least socially distanced. Some will find it easier than others, but some people will not, and you want to be creative in this endeavor. There are lots of ways of doing things that we can talk about, that you can replace your activities that we're previously doing in person with virtually activities. But I have to say, some businesses, the best choice may be to close or to get out of the business. So I helped a number of my coaching clients, for example, the COO of a chain of Midwestern restaurants, transition to a number of different positions. And she specifically transitioned to being the vice president of prepared foods in a major grocery store chain. So that's an example of a transition that you want to make exiting the business. Relationships. You want to get, this is an area of professional development. You want to learn how to use virtual collaboration, both to establish new relationships effectively and cultivate existing ones with external stakeholders of various sorts. Clients, service providers, political leaders are especially important given the money flowing from government coffers out to businesses and other organizations. Prospects, investors, suppliers of various sorts. This is an area where professional development will serve you very well. Managing disruption. Now, your here present for this webinar, you are realizing hopefully that you should not plan for the optimistic scenario. You should plan for the moderate or ideally the pessimistic one. But a lot of your external stakeholders will not. They won't plan for the long-term disruption of the pandemic. So you want to make a plan to protect yourself and your organization from their failures. Think about the shifting norms. We talked about how norms will change very drastically and rapidly over this period. After several years of these restrictions and loosenings, people will have different norms, values, habits, desires, and you want to get ahead of these shifts. Figure out where people will be and then serve their needs where they will be. And that's going to be how you will ensure your survival and thriving in this pandemic. You are meaning your organization and also your own career. Then think about unknown unknowns. You might have thought that the pandemic is an unknown unknown, what is also called a black swan. But it was a predictable disaster. It was something that a number of leaders were talking about, including some really prominent ones like Bill Gates, were talking about a pandemic as a serious issue. So that's something that a lot of people, insurance companies are selling pandemic insurance. That's something that your organization could have bought, but very few organizations actually bought that. So that wasn't very forward-looking with them. And there are a number of other predictable disasters that you can address. Look ahead, address in advance. That's something that you can look at. But there are, of course, some things that you can't predict, and some things can't be predicted. For example, a major solar flare could take out the GPS system and a number of electrical power generator systems. That's something that could be very bad, and that's something that can't be easily predicted at all. So that's something where you want to maintain a cash cushion for protection. And a number of companies would have been much better off in the pandemic if they had a cash cushion. I mean, airlines made money hand over fist, but they gave it all out to shareholders in the form of share buybacks, and now they're looking for government bailouts, of course. By contrast, Berkshire Hathaway built up a war cushion of over 180 billion in that cash cushion, and now it's using that to buy at a very cheap rate some very good companies. Finally, outcompeting your competition. This is something that your leaders will especially like. The steps I shared, if you implement them, if you take these steps, if you prepare for the moderate and ideally the pessimistic scenario, they'll help you gain a major competitive advantage over your competitors. Many will fail to adapt, many will stumble. So this is an opportunity for you to get ahead and help your leaders realize that's how they get ahead of their stumbling competitors. Seize market share, hire away good employees, and so on. So these are the 6 areas of the external business model that you want to shift for the pandemic. Now, let's go on to another poll. So check out the polling. I'll share my screen. How well has your organization transformed its organizational model to adapt to the pandemic? Please vote. So we saw the 51 people, so let's get those 51 people on the website. Let's make sure we have all of those people. Okay, we have 48, 50 people who are considering voting. 51, great. So let's get a few more votes. Give people 10 more seconds. So 10 more seconds to vote. Please go ahead and vote. Make your choice. Three, 2, 1. All right. So we see that just over 20% are doing great. That's wonderful. I'm really glad to hear that you're doing great. That's excellent. But the large majority of you are not. So just over 3/4 of you are not doing great. So just over half of you need some improvements, and it's great that you realize that you need those improvements. So you can use those 6 areas for the internal business model and those 6 areas for the external business model for improvements. So that's great that you're realizing that, but just under 1/4 of you need really serious work. So I'm glad that you realize that. So you want to look at these areas and see where you need that work and how you can implement that going forward. Great. Now let's do the last step, which is planning for the pandemic, planning for the long-term impact of the pandemic. How do you do it? So there are 6 steps that you take to look at the potential the impact of the pandemic and prepare yourself for the reality of the situation, not the optimistic scenario. Possible futures. Plan for a variety of possible futures and invest your resources accordingly. So you want to realize that it's certainly possible that it's going to be optimistic, 25% chance likelihood, vaccine widely available by 2022. Moderate, much more likely, 50% chance that it's going to be in 2024. Pessimistic can happen, it's going to be in 2027. So the moderate to pessimistic span is going to be 75% of the reality of the possible worlds in which we live. And given our luck recently, I don't think we're living in the optimistic scenario, unfortunately. We can, but it's possible, but it's unlikely. Then look at 5 years out. What's going to happen 5 years out to your organization, your company, and your own individual career, let's be honest, in this situation? What would your business look like? What would your career look like in 5 years in each of these scenarios? Optimistic, moderate, pessimistic. So optimistic, you'd have about 3 years of recovery, a year and a half of the pandemic and 3.5 years of recovery. Then in the moderate scenario, it would be 3.5 more years of the pandemic and then a year and a half of recovery. And the pessimistic one would still be in the depths of the pandemic by the time of 5 years. Problems. Think about what kind of problems you'll suffer in each of these. List your potential problems in each of these scenarios. Even in the moderate, even in the optimistic scenario, a year and a half the pandemic will not be great. So think about what kind of problems you'll suffer. Much more realistically, the moderate scenario, 3.5 years of the pandemic. And of course, the pessimistic one, more than 5 years of the pandemic. Think of ways of addressing these problems in advance. Again, great way to address them in advance is getting professional development in all of these areas that I outlined. Very important and very valuable. Or make a plan to resolve them if they occur. Opportunities. Fortunately, there's going to be some silver linings and opportunities that you can seize in each scenario. Think of ways of bringing them about. For example, some of my clients know that they have a number of prospects who are high-ticket prospects and who work with their competitors currently. So they have changed their marketing and sales pitches to say that, hey, we took these steps A through F to be pandemic-proof, and even for the most pessimistic scenario, for more than the pandemic will be over in 2027. So we are going to be really prepared for anything bad that happens. So if the pandemic goes on longer than my competitor anticipates, give me a call. And trust me, they will be giving them a call when their competitor is stumbling. Resources. Think about the kind of resources that you'll need in each of these scenarios. So for each of these scenarios, you'll need money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning time, of course, US project managers know that. Make a plan to reserve sufficient resources. For the pessimistic scenario, I strongly encourage that. At least the moderate one, don't plan for the optimistic scenario. Please don't. It's going to be not good for your future to plan for that. And finally, information. What kind of information would you see that would indicate to you which of these futures we're heading toward? So for example, you can be looking at what Bill Gates is saying about the future of vaccines. He's very invested into specifically philanthropically giving money to a number of vaccine companies. He's not going to make $1 from any vaccine that's going to hit the market. He's just investing in making sure there's a vaccine and it's going to be widely available, spending many, many billions of dollars on this. He's a good one to listen to see which scenario is actually taking place. Monitor it closely. Don't listen to politicized sources right now. I'm sorry to report that the CDC, the HHS, and other sources are experiencing political pressure to report more positive results than is the reality of the case. And of course, companies themselves are reporting very positive results in order to bid up their stock. So I know there's one company whose name I won't mention that specifically released positive results about positive results that didn't really mean anything. They're just, oh, we produced antibody responses. And then their stocks shot up, and then their executives sold about $30 million worth of stock after the stock shot up. Now, if you're really confident in your vaccine, are you really going to be selling $30 million worth of stock? No, I don't think so. So adjust your plans accordingly based on the information that you get, and then execute, execute, execute. All right, so last poll. Please go ahead to the poll. How well suited is your current strategic plan to the long-term impact, this long-term strategic consequences of the pandemic? Please vote. So again, let's give those 51 people over there and voting. do that. It's 37 people who voted. Let's get a bunch more. I'll give you 10 more seconds to vote, so make up your minds. Again, the last poll, make your voice heard. 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. All right, so we see that only 3% of you have a strategic plan that's well adapted. I'm glad that you realized that it's good for you, whoever has that. I think it should be only one person based on the votes, or 2 people. The large majority of you, 97%, need some tweaks to your strategic plan. And that's great that you're realizing that. About half of you need some moderate tweaks. Some moderate tweaks to your strategic plan. So you want to be thinking about how to introduce these moderate tweaks, how to do so effectively. And that's going to be something that you want to be thinking about and looking forward to. But the large majority of you need serious, not the large majority, I'm sorry, the rest of you, just under 50%, need serious revisions. So it's good that you realize that. It's hard to admit that your strategic plan needs serious revisions. And I'm proud of you for admitting this. It's not an easy thing to admit. So of course, this is an anonymous poll, so great that you can admit it. And it's a painful thing to admit, but it's very important to do so. And it's very important to revisit your strategic plan, not fall into that planning fallacy, which is very tempting to fall into, because planning fallacy, assuming that our plans will go according to plan, we don't pivot nearly quickly enough. In the last 3 months, I've done around 9 strategic consulting plans, strategic retreats, helping companies pivot. The last one was about 10 days ago for a unicorn startup that's worth about $1.4 billion. Pivoting in the context of COVID-19. They're realizing that they need to do it, and I'm glad that you're realizing that you need to do it as well. All right. So the last thing I want to mention is that you'll be getting some additional resources. Watch for an email from me for a free coaching session on this topic, and 2 chapters from my new book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So it'll be sent by email. Watch your email, and if you make sure that check spam if you didn't get it, so that's possible. I'm going to be sending from my email, gleb@disasteravoidanceexperts.com. All right, everyone. I'll be happy to take any questions at this stage. We have 56 people, so not too large of a group. You can unmute yourself, or you can leave your questions in the chat.
I want to mahalo Dr. Gleb for his insightful talk today. It gave me a lot to think about for my organization. And just want to remind everyone that's still on the call that the session's worth 1 strategic business management PDU that will be reported on your behalf if you're a chapter member with a PMI certification. So for those of you still on the call, if you have any burning questions or comments from this talk today, let's spend a couple of minutes here, and we really appreciate your time today. And you can either chat in the chat box or just unmute yourself right now, and we'll just give you a few moments here.
Tobias asked insights on tourism. So we'll have a lot of trouble. People will have a lot of trouble going back on tourism, especially to, of course, Hawaii. Tourism is such a major industry. But given the danger, real serious danger of airplanes, and even more, it's not simply airplanes. Airplanes are not super dangerous. They're no more dangerous than indoor dining. But the airports themselves and kind of going through the airport is actually more dangerous than being in an airplane. So you won't see tourism for a long time doing well. Unfortunately, this is not going to be something, I think you really will not see more than 50% of the previous level of tourism before we have a vaccine available.
Dr. Gleb, I work in education, and I have kids in schools, and we've seen all kinds of communications around schools trying to plan for returning to school based off different levels, in terms of like kind of doing it, green, yellow, red, and currently in Hawaii, we're in a red where most schools should be in distance learning right now, but
Mhm.
just kind of wondering what your thoughts are about kind of how education, how they're going to navigate from preschool to K through 12 and even colleges, how they're doing, what you see.
What I'm seeing right now is that increasing research is showing that children under 10 are less than 50% likely compared to children over 10 to spread COVID-19. So I'm suspecting, and of course, children under 10 are going to find it more difficult, are already finding it more difficult to learn online than in face-to-face. So I suspect that right now schools are being treated too much as a cohesive thing, too much as, you know, the same thing from K to 12. And that's not going to be the future. What I suspect will be the future based on the research and the evidence, both in terms of health outcomes, health outcomes for COVID-19, while younger kids under 10 still can get seriously sick, they're much less likely to than kids who are in their teens. When you're getting into your teens, you're getting into about the adult level sickness and adult level infection. In fact, teenagers are more likely to infect others than adults. It looks like because they're less likely to comply with social distancing and other guidelines. So what I'm guessing will happen is that there will be a separation of schools where elementary schools will be doing in person, and other schools, middle school, high school, will be doing more virtual in the future. That's my vision for the future, and of course, college includes that. Let's see. What are other questions? Cynthia asked about how are nonprofits rely on in-person events fundraising with a tanking economy. So this is definitely a difficult question. One of the benefits of living in Hawaii is, of course, the nice environment that you can do outdoor events. So I've seen a lot of nonprofits transitioning to socially distanced outdoor events for various forms of fundraising. And of course, virtual fundraising has been taking off as well, and especially when it's combined with effective visual engagement, as I'm using here Prezi video. Of course, it's much more effective visually than PowerPoint. So you want to do effective virtual engagement. So that's something to think about. Outdoor activities combined with virtual fundraisers. Edward asked, do you see Hawaii transitioning, building into new industries? Definitely. I mean, having less than 50% of your previous income from tourism, that is not sustainable. I definitely see Hawaii as getting into other industries, especially industries that are more technologically oriented, which is something that you can do much more virtually. So that's something I see as much more of in the future. Terry asks, what are the enduring effects of COVID that we may not be focused on right now? So you want to be thinking about these social norms, these shifts. One of the things that I think people aren't thinking about right now is the enduring effects of fear and anxiety on people. People's orientation, focus will be much more shifted toward security and defensiveness in the future. So another industry that looks like it's going to be doing well is, for example, the insurance industry. Insurance there are lots of more people are seeking insurance right now. You wouldn't have necessarily thought of that would be an industry, but that is a natural response to people feeling fear, negative emotions. They are seeking defensive industry. So that's something to be thinking about. How can you provide people with more safety, security, sense of control? Any insights on cultural institutions? So we talked about that. So botanical gardens, as an example, would be something that you can do some socially distanced stuff because they're outside. And that's something that you need to be doing. You need to be giving guidance to people and making sure that they, of course, comply with CDC guidelines and that they engage in social distancing when they go to botanical gardens. But more important than what you do is how you make people feel. You want to give people a sense that they will be safe when they come to your botanical garden. So you want to convey that you are ensuring that people are following CDC guidelines, that all visitors are following them, that you are having lower capacity or something like that, that people need to not be afraid, they need to not feel fear. And that's something that you can tell them and convince them that you will help them not feel fear. Other questions? Give folks 5 more seconds in case somebody's typing a question or is about to unmute themselves, so 5 more seconds. All right, I think we're ready to finish up.
Okay, well, mahalo, Dr. Gleb, for your time today with us, with our chapter. We hope all of you today have a great day and a great rest of the week. We look forward to the resources that you'll be sending to us, reading on that. And this recording will be available eventually on our chapter website, on our member section. So thank you again, and we hope you have a good week.
You're very welcome, everyone, and have a great day. It's been a
Take
pleasure.
care, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleb.
You're very welcome. Mahalo.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.